talk about life as the wife of a stake president and as a mission president counselor's wife. Talk about the time, what it was like for you when Dad served in the stake presidency and as counselor with mission presidents.
I loved all of Dad's years. I think it was about 8.5, close to 9 years. He served in the stake presidency, and we've been told that it's a little unusual for a stake presidency to be intact that long without being there some change in personnel. They had changes in executive secretaries or state clerks, but those three were together the whole time, and they were such a united, wonderful stake presidency. They were loved and respected throughout the stake, and those were happy times because we did a lot as a stake presidency. The Nordine Merkley and Shirley Heslop and myself, and so I can't say enough about how happy those years were. I always knew Dad's potential, and I was happy that the Lord knew his potential too, and that he was never stepped in front of the president, because that was not his way, but was the greatest support he could be, and was given many, many responsibilities within that stake presidency. And I loved not only Dad for himself being there, but I appreciated how the people of the stake loved all three members of that stake presidency. It was so wonderful. Those were years to be cherished. And what can I say? We did things, we attended wedding receptions often as a, not always, but often with the stake presidency intact, and we bought our gifts almost exclusively as stake presidency gifts. Nordine had a lot of gifts. She would buy them up ahead of time and store them in her garage, and then we would choose as the three sisters what we wanted to give to a particular couple. And those were happy, good times, good times. When Dad was a bishop, he was a little bit, not light-hearted, but his personality shone out a little bit more as a bishop, and he would kind of kid with board members, and I found myself once in a while going along behind him, and I said, you know, he's just teasing you. You know, he's not serious. But I never did that with him as a stake president, because he wore the title well, and he did as bishop too, but he just was a little closer in friendship to those ward members and could joke and kid and be a little bit more lighthearted with the ward members when he was a bishop, and a very beloved bishop too. So those were great years. When he was released as a member of the stake presidency, they were all released, he kind of rattled around a little bit, and we decided we would take a getaway. None of the kids were at home, it was just he and I. So we got in the car and drove up the coast of California, and we stopped at Pebble Beach and had lunch there, and he actually walked onto the 9th green at Pebble Beach, which was close to where we were having lunch, and I tried to talk him into spending the money to golf around there, although it would have been pretty pricey. But I said, you've loved golf all your life and you have a special feeling for Pebble Beach. But he was too conservative, he wouldn't spend that much money. So we watched other people golf and ate lunch right at that 9th green, and went up to Monterey and went around the 17-mile drive and tootled our way on up the coast, got to San Francisco, got a motel in a nice hotel, and did the things you do at San Francisco. We had planned to stay 2 or 3 days there. I don't remember what our exact plans were, but as I recall, we stayed one day and we went to Giardelli Square, and we went to every place I can't remember. Rode the trolley and all the things that San Francisco's famous for. And after a while, Dad looked at me and he said, "Anything else you want to do?" And I said, "Not really." He said, "Should we leave and go see the kids?" So here was our getaway, just the two of us. And we had had a good time, and we had stopped overnight along the way, and we stopped and saw Mel and LaRue and Don and Barbara Hazard while we were there. But then we got in the car and just drove to Sacramento. We didn't even let Karen and Mark know we were coming there. We'd had enough of sightseeing and all the things people do sightseeing. It was more fun to go and see the kids. And so we rang their doorbell, and they were surprised to see us. And we said, "Oh, we're just out taking life easy," and thought we'd take a little trip, and we ended up at your door. So then the other comparison, I have to tell you, when he was called into the mission presidency, because he was kind of rattling around. I don't remember what calling he had when he was released. He may not even have had a calling, because just so newly released from the stake presidency, and they're trying to the new stake presidency is reorganizing. But he must have had some calling, whether it was on the high priest or the high council or something. I really can't remember. But anyhow, he had done something else and had come back to our ward for our sacrament meeting, and he was sitting on the very back row before the curtain or the folding door that you could open up onto the cultural hall if you wanted, all by himself. And the mission president was Gary Coleman, who was a 70. He was a mission president, and he was in line to get, he was not too many months left in his mission, but he was looking for another first counselor for the mission presidency. And he walked in the hallway, glanced in that sacrament meeting, saw Dad sitting on that last row, and the Spirit whispered to him, "That's your next counselor." And that's how he became involved in missionary work in Arcadia Stake, is because President Coleman saw him, and the Spirit whispered that that's who he should ask for. And of course he was, the stake presidency gave their permission, and he became a counselor for the remainder of Gary Coleman's mission. And he had Dad and I both come into his office, and they talked to us about the responsibilities of the mission and some of the duties and concerns and the need to be united together, a lot of counsel. And Dad was a counselor to Gary Coleman until his mission ended. And then the new president was...
Foster.
No, before Foster. His name escapes me at the mission, and I'm sorry, it'll come to me sometime. But he and his wife were from Utah, and they had been called as mission presidents and wife to the country of Colombia. And that's when they were having such drug wars, and the situation became so tense in Colombia that they withdrew all the North American missionaries. They didn't close the mission, but they kept it going with just native Colombians. And it might have gone beyond the borders of Colombia, but all of the North Americans were withdrawn. And so they had this wonderful mission president who had served 1 year in Colombia and what to do with him. So they sent him to Arcadia for 2 years to finish out his 3-year mission call. So he was only there 2 years, and he interviewed and talked to Dad and wanted Dad to be his first counselor. And there was a Spanish-speaking man, who was an educator, that was the second counselor, because a lot of the Arcadia mission involved Spanish-speaking parts too, and this other man was a good interface with the Spanish speakers. But Dad, when he was with both President Coleman and President, I can't think of his name, it was pretty much a weekend call. The mission presidents took care of the missionaries and their day-to-day need, week in, week out, and they had couples. One was an office couple, one was a transportation couple, one was a housing couple, and so they had those responsibilities within the mission. And so Dad's was mostly weekend work, but he loved it, and Dad never ever had a call. It could have been a call as janitor, and he would have given it his all, because he loved whatever he did. He put his whole heart and soul into it. And so when that mission president finished his 2 years, then the new president came, and that was Brad and Cheryl Foster from Rigby, Idaho, if you can imagine. And President Foster interviewed Dad and the other second counselor, and he was happy with them both. He felt impressed he shouldn't make a change, and so he kept the change, and hadn't been there very long before the missionary department decided they're always doing pilot programs to see if it works. And so they had devised a pilot program, and they wanted to put it in place in the Arcadia mission, because it was a big mission with a big complement of sister and elder missionaries. And so they called Dad as a full-time second missionary president. He really didn't have he still worked under President Foster, but in ways they wanted them to be pretty close to equal with the final word, because you can't have two bosses. But it was still President Foster. But Dad was called full-time into that mission, and the idea was to see if two full-time people in the mission presidency could handle a larger complement of missionaries. So you could still have one mission presidency, but with two of them being full-time, and they had enough manpower to increase the numbers in those missions. And so President Foster has said many times since, he said, when they first gave him to me, I didn't know what to do with him. And it wasn't very long before I didn't know how I would ever have done without him, because Dad did not presume to replace him. He worked with him. He was always differential, but he was a workhorse. And along there, when he hadn't been called full-time too long, is when the Northridge earthquake struck out in the San Fernando Valley. And it was a pretty devastating earthquake, and a lot of people displaced, and a lot of Spanish-speaking people displaced. And so the church offered their full-time missionaries, Spanish-speaking missionaries, to the earthquake effort on that short-term basis. So because they had the language skills to go in and work with, there were whole buildings that were damaged, and tent cities, and freeways that had collapsed, apartment buildings that had sandwiched down. It was a big earthquake. And so Dad went initially to be in charge of those missionaries. Even though he didn't speak Spanish, he was over the missionary efforts of all these Spanish speakers and doing what he could to help. And before long, the church put him under the direction of a 70, put him over all of the church's efforts, post-earthquake efforts. And so Dad, we didn't have cell phones then. Dad would be out there all day long in the field working and helping with these efforts. He would be on the phone. He came home at night, and I just said, whoever was at home, forget it, because we don't use the phone. Dad took over our phone. If he wasn't at the mission office using a phone, he was here coordinating, and Dad was a great, great leader. He had a unique leadership style, but one that everybody respected and everybody followed. And so he took over not only the missionaries that were helping with the language, but he took over food being brought in for the displaced people. He took in all the efforts of the church to send quilts and blankets and supplies and food storage and whatever. It all went through Dad, and he had a 70 over him, but Dad was the workhorse. And I wish I could remember how long he worked. It was an extended period of time that he worked in that effort and did an invaluable service to the church and to that whole San Fernando Valley that had the benefit of his skills and dedication and devotion and work ethic, all of those combined, that he did that. And then when that was all over and done with...
Let me
okay.
follow with some of my recollection just for the completeness there. It's my understanding that the point in time that pretty much Dad and the church led the entire effort there, that the Red Cross and everybody else was kind of...
You're right.
was assisting, and so it really was Dad that led that effort. And the point in time came where Dad said, enough has been done, and you know, people are on their own and they can, and so Dad made the decision that the church was pulling out, and the next day in the newspaper was the announcement that the Red Cross was finishing their relief effort relative to the, so it was really Dad, when Dad decided to pull the church's, you know, support away, that all of the other Red Cross and the other organizations decided that they were leaving also. So he's the one that shut down that relief effort.
Well, thank you. I always had to be careful because Dad didn't want me ever to embellish on anything I did or anything he did. He was a very humble, unassuming man who would work his heart out and could care not a nickel if he got any credit for it. That's just the way he was. But when it was all said and done and we were back to regular missionary activities, then his responsibilities went all week long. It was no longer a weekend thing, and he would be over areas of the mission that was his responsibility, and President Foster would be over other areas. And I never was invited to really be a part. A mission president has a wife that stands beside him. This second mission president, they didn't call and set me apart as that, but I was there to help. And Sister Foster used me all the time whenever we had a luncheon or a meeting where you drew
Zone conference.
A zone conference or such, that I was always drawn in, and I was the one that in effect headed up that. And I always, because I had learned through my association with these wonderfully cultured women of the church, that you didn't do something second rate. So whenever I had a dinner, beautiful tablecloths, napkins, I didn't know how to fold them myself, but I drew in my friends. Cindy Cutler or somebody would come. Beautiful flowers, everything done. You served it as elegantly as you could. And she appreciated that because she was an Idaho farm woman. And I loved the fact that I could do that and be a part of that and be a part of the sisters' conferences and that sort of thing. So I was drawn in a lot. One time we had I don't know whether it was a zone conference or the whole mission conference, but we met in the Arcadia Foothill building, and I don't know who decided it because I didn't, but there's several of us who knew how to make cinnamon rolls, went early in the morning, and while the mission presidents and all the mission staff were in the cultural hall and the chapel doing all the things that their conference called for, some of the hatches and me, those are the ones I remember most. There may have been others, but that's what I recall. We were out in the kitchen making up dough and letting it rise and forming it into cinnamon rolls and making the frosting that went on them. And so and we had a lot of milk. And as this conference went on, the missionaries could smell the smells of the baking cinnamon rolls. And when the conference stopped, we had enough cinnamon rolls that they ate, cinnamon rolls and milk. They ate to their heart's content, and we took home. And I really think it was the whole mission, because we chugged out a lot of cinnamon rolls that day, but that was one of my funnest memories of being involved with the missionaries. And when we had a couple of times when we could take the missionaries to the temple. It was outside of our district, but we had permission. And the Los Angeles temple is a big temple, but we didn't want to close down the mission, so we would divide the number of missionaries in half, and half would stay home and man all the missionary work in the office and the telephones and everything, and we would take half to the mission, or to the temple, and they'd have that temple experience. Then we would come back and all the missionaries would switch places, but we didn't switch places. Then we took the second half of the mission out to the temple again and had those beautiful special temple experiences with our entire mission. And we learned to love the full-time couples that served in the mission with Dad and with President Foster. And we recruited people from the state. We recruited Marlo and Barbara Bowen to become full-time missionaries, live at home full-time missionaries. And they were in charge of either housing or transportation. I've forgotten now which one. But they loved it, and I don't think they ever would have served a mission if it hadn't been for Dad reaching out and drawing them in and making them feel like that they had a full-time mission experience there. And when we were getting ready for the Fosters to leave, they were going to open up somewhere in the kind of the closing months of his stay. They were opening a new mission in San Fernando Valley. And so the church, not us, they found the home, and it had suffered some earthquake damage, but they had a beautiful home. They had gone through all the repairs that it needed, and people whose job it was to furnish the physical things. It wasn't us, but they had people that was their job to bring the furniture in, and the sheets and the towels and the dishes and everything, to start from scratch and make that a mission home for the mission president and his wife. And Dad and I were asked by President Foster to go out and take charge of that effort. And so the people would bring in these things, but we would arrange them and decide which dishes went in what cupboard and where the linens went. And it was so fun. And then as it got closer, it was the Snows from St. George. He's now a 70. He was the new mission president. That we put away the silverware. We stocked this, S-T-O-C-K-E-D, not stalked, but stocked the cupboards and the refrigerator with food for them and greeted them when they came as new mission president and wife. So we met Elder Snow when he was President Snow, a mission president. And then when later he was called to the 70 and we were in the MTC, we renewed that friendship with him. But that was a sweet experience that we had that was different. And not only the mission home, but they had to set up and get functioning the mission office, which was separate from the home. And so again, we didn't have any say in choosing the location, but it was a building, and Dad got to help with some of the partitions that were put up to set that space up so it would function as a mission home. And missionaries from our mission that came and helped, and then ultimately helped train, we all helped, not we, but Dad and the full-time couples that came and helped organize and set up the office and get it functioning in time. Then they in turn trained President Snow and the missionaries that came to man his office. So that was a sweet time to be part of the establishment of a new mission in the church and have that opportunity, which doesn't come to very many people very often, but it came to us. And then in time, when the Fosters completed their mission, then I can't remember of the mission president who followed, but he wanted Dad to stay on. And we had planned, until Dad got involved with missionary work, we had planned to retire and come to Utah. And so he was retired, that's why he could do all this full time. But we hadn't made far long enough in our life to actually move to Utah. And so he said to this mission president, I would be happy to stay for 2 or 3 months or whatever, I don't know what time they agreed upon, until you get your feet there and select counselors to take over. And so Dad worked with that 4th mission president for a short time before we finally said adieu and moved. It was just around Thanksgiving time when we moved to Utah, and the new mission president came in the 1st of July, so we were there July, August, and September at least, and maybe into October. I can't remember when he withdrew slowly from there, or would probably still be there as a counselor to whoever the mission president was, because those were great years. And Dad loved it. We had funny times. We had heart-wrenching times, because we lived the lives of the missionaries. And so when they had problems, their problems were our problems. And we'd have a missionary that just wasn't making it in the mission, and President Foster would say, can you take them into your home? And so we had missionaries that came and lived in our home until they got squared enough away. Instead of getting sent home, they came to our home, and we helped them get on track and be able to put their heart and soul into their missions and complete a successful mission instead of being sent home early. We had that experience. We had the experience sometimes of visa waiters who were coming from the MTC and were supposed to go Europe, who knows where, different places, but they couldn't get their visas, and so the church didn't want them to stay in the MTC forever, so they would choose missions and send them out. And because we had 2 full-time, in essence, mission presidents, they felt comfortable sending visa waiters to Arcadia, and they would come and proselyte and serve with the missionaries who were in the mission and grow to love it. And some of them stayed with us while they were waiting, and then when their visas came through, we would send them on their way to Spain, who knows where, on their missions. And so we had sweet experiences with those people too.
Just for completeness, as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the assignments that Dad had as this commission president was, I believe he had responsibility for all of the non-English, non-Spanish speaking missionaries in Southern California, from Los Angeles clear down to the Mexican border.
I think you're right on that.
That it didn't matter what mission that they were called to, if it was Cambodian or Laotian or whatever, Hmongs, that Dad had responsibility for moving those missionaries to wherever the work required, independent of mission boundaries. So he might take a set of missionaries, Laotian missionaries from the Arcadia mission, and send them down to the San Diego mission, but that was part of his, correct me if I'm wrong, that was part of his responsibility, was for the non-Spanish speaking, non-English speaking missionaries. He was essentially the mission president for them as far as assigning them where to go and where to serve in all of Southern California.
You're correct. I'd forgotten that, and I'm ready for a break.
Okay.